but it's very important to plan for the future. That's where having a good architect guiding you through this process is very important. We have gone into organizations, like we work with many organizations like yourself, law firm, etc. We go in, someone else implemented, and it's like you're building something, the architecture is messed up, and we are putting more and more structure on top of it. It doesn't matter how much things we build, if the base architecture is messed up, it's hard to kind of work around that, right? So it's super important to get the architecture right. All right, guys, we'll get started. And just so I get an idea about the audience, most of you have already implemented Specright or in the process of implementing Specright. Kind of the breakdown, those of you already live on Specright? Got it. And those of you are live, what's your main points you want to get out of the session? Maybe you're looking into future enhancements, you want to learn the best practices.
Future enhancements, projects.
Got it. Makes sense. And what about the rest of the group who in the process of going live with Specright? Is that right? So a little bit background about myself. I come from the SaaS world. Company was launched in 2012, and we have been successful in many verticals. We started off with the financial services segment. Later on, veered into other segments. Web solutioned, architected, business process, many automations, and now obviously into the AI world, but for many verticals. So when we start at the corporate world, when I ran sales and marketing operations, obviously hiring employees, right? That was, we would interview hundreds of people and won't find qualified people. So when we launched the company, we ended up creating a separate education division where we trained, architects, developers, admins, right? And hired from that set of people. So if I sound like a professor, right? Because not just running the company, but I also have been teaching, and we have students working at Salesforce as an architect and other companies everywhere. So if I sound like a professor, sorry, I'll try not to. All right, so because I also teach. So we're going to talk about the complexity, the implementation process. I'm going to talk about one of the basic element when we start the implementation is the data model, right? We'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the data migration process. I think data model, capturing the data model, that is a very important part of the process. We'll talk about the data migration process. We'll talk about the overall implementation process, all right? So we'll get into that. When we capture the BRD, right? Those of you are live, right? What is the first thing we do? We figure out if you are tackling packaging, right? What we tell you is make sure every packaging type is a record type, right? So you have to understand like what's your primary packaging, what the dimensions are, what the material is made out of. Let's say you have a perfume bottle, right? So the way we start collecting data initially during the BRD gathering process, the data model is what the foundation of everything you build on top of it, right? So forget about Salesforce, forget about Specright. Let's go back to the 90s when we used to use pen and paper, right? So if you are implementing packaging, we had, I don't know, bottles, perfumes in 90s before computers, didn't we? Early 90s, right? 80s, we had products, right? So all this process, right? But before all of that, we had to do some foundational things, right? You have to know what your data is. If you're doing it in the Excel piece of paper, you have to know like what your bottle looks like, what packaging looks like, what box it goes into, right? So with Specright, the data model, we have to capture it. So before you start the implementation, understanding, let's say you have a perfume, like the bottle, the dimensions, and what you want to cover, right? The packaging that bottle goes into, and maybe you have a tertiary packaging. So one of the first things we work with you in figuring out what are those, right? Don't worry about how it translates into Specright. Obviously, Specright, you have packaging, you have different record types, right? With the ingredients, there's different data models. But biggest thing as a client, we want to know from your verbiage, how do you do it right now, right? Maybe you're doing it in Excel. We had a client in an automobile sector. I'm not going to mention the name, and they were doing all in Excel, right? Massive Excel, like highly complicated, so much data, right? And in the Excel, you're not really doing data engineering. You're collecting a bunch of data, you're linking parent-child, right? But it's not that organized, right? So what happens, it's not sustainable. So when you translate that into a Specright, one of the we work with you in figuring out what should be the correct data model. Make sense? So who is live right now? Okay, so when did you go live? May of last year. And what did you implement? Packaging, ingredients?
All the above. Packaging, finished goods, chemicals.
You did all of them.
Yeah, we did all of them.
So so did you have all of those defined before you came to Specright, or did you figure it out as you've gone on in the project?
We had specifications for those, but they were paper-based.
Right.
So then we had to translate that into what those would look like within Specright, and also determine what was still value added and not value added.
Got it. So when you were going through the transformation, did you end up finding, okay, now I want to better track maybe allergen information or sustainability details, like on paper to a digital transformation, that migration process, right? We can build anything your mind can imagine, but the data has to come from you, right?
And we did kind of preload some sustainability metrics in there. You know, I don't know how everybody else palm oil, palm kernel oil, and other sustainability metrics in there. We haven't loaded all this data yet.
Right.
We were looking into the future and what we would eventually want to put in there. So
I think what you said, Valerie, is very key, because when we are going through implementation, right? What happens? Salesperson works with you, a scope gets put together, you have a scope written down, like you're going to do packaging, 10 record types, you're going to do ingredients, right? There's some scope written down. When you come to a requirements gathering session, is it me or is it really hot in here? So what Valerie said is very key, because you have a scope that you start working with. That scope is typically worked out with the senior management team, right? And then you come to us for implementation. We look at the scope, maybe what sales reps talk to you about. You talked about your packaging and your secondary packaging, your ingredients, you want to track formula, etc. All of that you talk to the sales reps, and information gets passed to us. We come to us, right? And you have your existing maybe packaging sheet, but maybe you only bought part of it. Maybe you didn't buy the full everything you want to do. But it's very important to plan for the future. That's where having a good architect guiding you through this process is very important, because we have gone into organizations, like we work with many organizations like yourself, law firm, etc. We go in, someone else implemented, and it's like you're building something. If the architecture is messed up and we are putting more and more structure on top of it, it doesn't matter how much things we build. If the base architecture is messed up, it's hard to kind of work around that, right? So it's super important to get the architecture right. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the architecture, okay? Is that okay, everyone? Okay. So like Valerie said, she thought of future, what she needs to do in mind when she was implementing. So whoever is the architect is, make sure you tell them, okay, right now I didn't buy all this, but I will build maybe other objects or other functionalities. Make sure you keep that in mind when you're defining my ingredients, because right now I don't have access to this other object, but the future I may. Make sense? Maybe you didn't buy the supplier portal. In the future, you may go to other direction. So everything you're building, someone should keep in mind, hey, they may do supplier portal in the future. Now, is it possible to go back and do it? Yes. But it's a lot easier when your foundation is accurate.
yes, could we also put in supplier data, but we don't have the supplier module that's further down the right for us? So if we input that information now, when we turn on the supplier module, you already have that information and it makes reports.
What if you don't already have it? How is architecture supposed to connect everything if there's something that you don't have?
I'll answer that. So, like the platform that Specright is built on is a platform where you dream up something, we can do it. You want to integrate it with infinite systems, we can do it. There's nothing we cannot do. The only thing is, later on, it's going to cost you more money, more hours. Because before, maybe if we did it on the start, it would have been done as part of the initial project. It would have taken you less hours. But then when you do it later on, it'll probably cost you more money because we have to go back and make changes, right? And you have existing data you already worked on. So let me just give an example. You have a live org. So you have a car that's running on the highway. It's like keeping the car running on the highway while making a tire change, right? Because you have a running org. Right now, you can say, okay, we're going to do it in a sandbox and roll to production. Yes, we know all the tricks how to do it. But the analogy is your car's running, we're doing something to your car, right? So which is possible, it's just more expensive. All right, and if you get a bad implementation firm, they can mess up your data. And data migration, like we have done probably, I don't know, hundreds of migrations across, financial industry, law firms, you name it. Law firms are the most complicated because everything legally required. You mess up one client's document, it's $1 million lawsuit, right? Yeah, data migration has to be extremely, extremely carefully done. So especially when you're live and building functionality. Make sense? Okay, so going back to the data model, right? So it's very important to understand your own data model. We have it on a piece of paper, you have a spec sheet, but understand it. And then if someone is implementing, talk to them, okay, this is what I have, right? Talk to me how, let's say if you're cosmetics, the data model is going to be different than if you are food and beverage, right? So this is especially food and beverage, like formula is a little bit off. That's a huge problem, right? So configuration of the architecture, that's what the better BRD you create, the better it will be. Don't just sign off on the BRD. Like if the implementer is going through the details, you have a scope, don't just blindly trust it. Okay, confirm every single details. And if you don't find 30 things that are wrong, the BRD is not final, right? Like we tell the clients, here's the issue list. Unless you log 30 issues, at least we, and in the past we were a little bit relaxed, but we kind of mandated, like, unless you log 30 issues like you found with the BRD, we're not going to sign off as a company, right? So it's extremely important that you capture the data model. So Valerie, thank you for your input, and Amanda, thank you for your input. So those are great key points, like Valerie said, Amanda said. So, all right, so now we're working through the data model, right? You captured the data model, you tested the data model, right? What are the other things that are important for your organization besides data model, right? Approvals, right? Version control. What else, Valerie? Besides data model, figuring out what your data will look like, right? And the BRD, figuring out approvals. What are the things that were important to you when you went live?
So we were paper based, and
Right.
we wanted to condense down our approvals and how many approvals people there were on that approval workflow. So a lot of workflows were important to us, and for each of our objects, you may have different people.
Bingo. Right. So before you went to automation, right? When it was paper-based or Excel-based, so did you already have a process in place? Like, okay, this person will approve this person will approve this?
Slightly.
Right.
It's one of those where people would submit a paper document. They'd be like, oh, I want Tim and Matt and Laura and all these other people on there. So that would create an extended long period of time to get those approvals.
Right.
Whereas for specifications, they're only, quality, packaging, regulatory, whoever needs to be on those that are specific. So I was not having that.
So this is key, because before, I want to capture that, before Valerie went to Specright, she had an Excel-based process, right? But she did not have proper, she had an approval process, but not the way she has it now. So What does that tell me? We're not simply converting a paper process into a digital process. We're actually re-architecturing your business. So what happens if you don't have those key people who knows the process, who are giving input they're missing during the requirements gathering? And you have signed off on the BRD, right? Now you just changed your company's process, and the guy who needs to give input, he wasn't even in the meeting. And we're like, oh, we got to sign BRD, right? Anyone had that issue? Yeah. So it's extremely important. What I'm trying to get to is identify your stakeholders, right? A lot of times that happens outside our meetings, right? And so it comes to us, and our job is to make sure, okay, did all the stakeholders sign off? And it's not just Specright. Any vertical we're implementing, the same story. If you don't have the proper stakeholders sign up, it's a problem. So one of the first things I ask my employees to do, identify the stakeholders, right? Who will approve what? And a lot of times I will see the same name approving every single one. I'm like, I think there's a problem, right? And then, well, no, customers said they are the ones who approve. Well, ask again. And when you ask the second time, look, oh no, I have to go to John, who manages that department. But by the time Nancy already signed off, she didn't ask John, right? So these things are, during the implementation process, super important, capture correctly, right? And a lot of you nodded when I asked, like, is that a problem, right? So that means you're running into these issues. So believe it or not, those small things, once implementation gets going, later on, goes to the testing phase, and that John now comes to the picture. He's doing UAT, right? We just build the whole system based on Nancy's input, but then John's the one stakeholder. Nancy said John signed off, but John's now doing UAT. What happens? John doesn't like it. So what happens? Change request, right? More expense for everybody, right? Project goes off. We get yelled by Adam, right? Like, like, so one of the things I always, train our team is identify the proper approvers. That's very important. Okay, so you have identified your data model. It's captured nicely. You've identified who is approving the data model, right? Like, okay, I know these are how I'm going to capture it. These are all the fields that are important, right? I captured my dimensions. I captured my material type, all that variables. Now, maybe there's a new federal regulation about sustainability, right? Maybe that's missing. So, and then maybe you have to add that as part of some automation. So you miss that one new requirement, it affects what happens downstream, right? And you may not capture it until it goes all the way in the UAT. Then someone says, oh, where is this new requirement? And then you have to go back and make a bunch of changes, which is possible to do, but that's why BRD process is extremely important. A lot of us think like, okay, you go in, you have your existing process, collecting it. No, like Valerie said, you had some stuff, but you had to go and figure out new things. And not only that, you thought of, okay, I will add the supplier details, even though I don't have supplier portal, because in the future I will buy supplier portal, right? So then Adam wants to sell you the supplier portal. It's a lot easier because it's already there, right, Adam? Yeah. So, and all right, any questions so far on the data model or the approval process for figuring out the data model? I'm not talking about the approval process for getting it approved when you insert a new spec. I'm talking about the internal process. Any questions on that? Yes.
How do you anticipate customizations that'll cost you time in the future for
upgrades and things like that? Because that's one thing that we're trying to be cognizant of, but it's not too clear. There's like how much of a negative impact we'll have by making a customization.
That's a good question. So as a SaaS product, right, Specright, it's always goal to keep things standard, right, as standard as possible. But every business is different, so we get that it won't be always the same. So there are some customizations needed. Now, if you haven't anticipated customizations down the road, the nice thing is Specright platform is built in a way that you can add additional factors, you can make changes. Not impossible. It's just a matter of hours, right? And a lot of times, a lot of our clients, what they do is How many of you have internal admins who manage your Specright system? You're an admin? Okay, good. Some of you do. So internal admins, right? Maybe you tackle 99%, 90% of the stuff, right? We have clients that have 90% of the stuff internal admins are doing, but they're like, okay, I need to make this system change. I'm not comfortable. So they'll send that to companies like us, right? So they'll have us on retainer, maybe, I don't know, 5 hours a week. But Nancy does 99% of the stuff. Valerie does 99% of the stuff. We do 5%, right? So that can kind of keep your cost low. If you have someone like a ongoing admin on staff, I don't know, 5 hours a week that you know, hey, John, can you do this? I recommend that. All right. Yes.
What do you do with your stage gate? And like, I feel like stage gate is like almost as a platform than the NPD packaging and product development, and it doesn't flow back in.
Right. I mean, that's a good question. Like, how have you done it so far? Tell me, let's talk.
Well, it's just completely separate. Like the commercialization team doesn't even know they're using Specright.
Right.
Right. Wow.
Right.
So they should assume they're using Salesforce. And then when I'm saying like, okay, well, how does my spec go into your system, Specright? They're like, wait, what Specright?
I mean, it goes back to data architecture, right? So it's just like, so we have done, I don't know, probably since 2012, our funding, probably hundreds and hundreds of system integrations. If you're, most systems have REST API, right? So whenever another system's trying to integrate with Specright, they're using the Specright API, pushing the data in, right? But the data model has to be there. So the data model, if that's not data model, again, goes back to the architecture session. Maybe you're pushing from SAP to SAP is tough, right, to integrate with. We all know that, but they do have API. So you're integrating from SAP to with Specright or vice versa. So in data, when we do data migration, what we call is mapping workbook, right? We figure out, okay, in Specright, we're calling it packaging, and these are the fields. In SAP, it's called something else, and these are the fields. And by the way, the drop-down field, what we call pick list in Specright, options in SAP, there's some other options. Maybe it's spelled a little bit differently. Does that make sense? So you try to push from SAP to Specright, it fails because that option either is not there or it's spelled incorrectly. Anyone run into that? I see a lot of head nodding, right? So this is where, if you don't have a data mapping workbook clearly defined, there's a problem. If you don't have what we call value translation, write this down, value translation workbook. I teach Salesforce, right, over a decade because we internally launched the school, internally trained, hired employees, because every time I interview hundreds of candidates, 99% fake resumes. So we will internally send to our Micronet school, train, so I teach. So if I sound like a professor, sorry. So value translation workbook, that's what it's called. You should have a value translation workbook. You should have a data migration workbook. All right, that will save you life. Like if objects that you're defining, if you have pick list fields, a lot of times what happens when you do system integrations, there's a restriction on the drop-down field on Salesforce, on Specright, and other systems trying to push, and it's failing because there's a restriction on the pick list, right? I see a lot of head nodding. So you can avoid that problem by having a value translation workbook, okay? You simply have, okay, on the left side, this is what option is in Specright, and on the right side, SAP, and if there's a mismatch, then whatever middleware you're using to integrate, right, either direct REST API, MuleSoft, or whatever module, it will be way easier to connect. Oh, you did. Yeah, so what I recommend is every single object that you have in the system, you should have a separate tab, and then typically you'll map out at least the pick list, the drop down. And I would, even if you have a really complicated separation between objects, like maybe you have different record types, right? And lots of differences. You probably should have separate tabs for each record type and map out this is what Oracle's value is, this is Specright's value. That translation workbook will save you life. Going back to did I answer your question? Originally, you had us.
Sorry, yes.
Okay, good, good. Okay, and feel free to interrupt. Okay, I want this to be interactive, not like a giant one-way conversation. All right. So far, anyone bored? Are you guys finding this useful? Yeah. Why?
Well, because like there's just so much that I needed to have done differently when implementing
Should have known George.
the BRD, like just the whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's not anything that great. It's from our side.
Yeah. It's normal. So don't feel bad. So we see that at every organization. Like you have grown organically. You had put Excel initially, right? People putting in whatever values you want. There was no control. Then you got to a system like Specright. There's control in place, but in SAP, people are inputting whatever they want, right? So if you don't have, if you have integration between SAP and Specright and things that are constantly being updated on the SAP side, people are entering whatever they want, there will be constant failure. So you want to make sure Specright is your source of record, right? For the data you're storing in Specright. And instead of making the drop-down updates in SAP, if SAP is not fully controlled, then you should do it in Specright and push it the other way.
And we're a multi-billion-dollar company that is cheap.
Yeah.
We don't want to spend any money.
Well, you end up spending more long-term, right? Yes. So, all right. So we talked a lot about integration, version control, right? So Specright has great features, which are like version control. You have a specification, right? You constantly changing your versions. So data migration. Before I go into that, I want to talk a little bit about data migration. We talked already as answering your questions, but once part of the BRD is, we just typically have a line like data migration, certain number of hours is typically not defined in there, right? And some of you say we will do our own migration, right? And as an architect teaching over a decade, doing your own data migration, unless you're an architect, is a bad idea, right? How many of you architected your own data migration? How did that go? Yeah.
It really did. We did all the templates, but also you have a lot of people from the different objects putting in different ones.
Yeah.
We got doubles, some caps, some did not use caps, and so it was a lot.
Do you have a lot of duplicates offline?
We had some only because not a bunch. In certain areas, we had duplicates.
Right.
Because, like I said, on one sheet it would be in caps, and then another sheet it would be in upper lowercase.
Right.
So that in turn created duplicates with that. Also, you get errors a lot, and people don't use what's in the pick list. You know, that's another hazard. So yeah, it was pretty long. We went through a lot of errors. I'll just say that.
Yeah, that is very common. What I see when you try to, like, a lot of times we think data migration is easy. Get the data, load it in, simple, right? No, not really. Data is complicated enough to have a whole data science behind it. And so our data team, typically what we do, we call, like, anytime there's a data we capture from you, it has to go through a normalization sequence. So we have, Python developers, right? Because Python is the best language. Like, the reason AIs use Python is very easy and best language to manipulate data, right? So like whenever we feed data to AI for AI trading, right? Python's the language that helps us normalize the data. So data normalization is a step, is key. So if you don't have a Python developer, it's probably not a good idea. You want to get your data normalized first before even you feed it into, upload it into the system. And sometimes some companies have duplicates. For example, what do I mean by duplicates? You have a specs are fine. But if you're a supplier, ABC company have a address in Tennessee and Texas, and maybe they have multiple warehouses. So you're linking the different address with different records. Does that happen? In migration, does that happen? Different supplier address goes to different, right? So like those things, the data migration is very important, making sure proper entities are mapped out to proper records, right? Deduplication, because in legacy systems, duplicate data is very normal, especially like company name, company addresses, multiple entries of the same company happens all the time, right? So you have to have a data deduplication strategy. Okay, so you have your data mapped out in a workbook. You have the value translation done. All your data are normalized. Then what we do is, I'm going to move over to the, you have the, what we do is we do a test load initially, right? So you don't want to load all your data at once. You want to do a test load in a sandbox environment, right? And then there should be a lot of back and forth testing. And once that's successful, then you do a full load, right? So data migration is a full topic. I can talk for hours and hours and hours. I have different podcasts out there for data migration, but it's a very important topic. So don't take it lightly. So your BRD is capturing your configuration. You got the data migration strategy in place. Now, here what we're talking about is testing. So as we are building, your BRD is done, we're building it. I mean, there needs to be a combination of waterfall model and agile, right? Because the pure waterfall doesn't work, right? You have to have some agile. So as we're building, you should be testing. We build something, you test it, we move forward. Don't wait all the way at the end to test. Most of you tested as things were going build, or, yep, okay. And when you're doing UAT, what's the minimum number of acceptable issues you should log? Your team should log before you allow system to go to production. Any idea? Like if you want to go live to a brand new system and people are testing, right? There should be a minimum number of issues you require. Find me at least 100 issues with the system. You should have a number. Unless people log this many issues, you're not going to allow people to go live. So what happens is, even if there's no bug, people will start using the system. They'll say, oh, this doesn't work. We'll go and say, no, it's working. You just have to do it this way. So what happens is, if you do a proper testing, you'll capture not just bugs, but all the different user-related issues during UAT, right? Because one of the biggest challenge in any project is what? Adoption, right? So you can probably force your people to use the system, but how many of you find it hard to get different departments to cooperate with the new system? Yep, right? Anyone else? So get them involved. If you have other departments you're working with, get them involved in the project early, right? Don't wait all the way at the end to call John in other departments. Hey, I need you to quickly test. So you'll be sending me data. No. Get them involved early. Maybe not in every meeting, but bring them in at least to the testing, right? Have at least 10 different people testing from different departments if you can. Ask them for an hour. Just go through and log your issues. 100 issues minimum, I would say, before you allow anything to go to production, right? That's our rule. Like, we don't allow deployment unless there's 100 issues. Like 100 is the arbitrary number. Maybe they get to 70. Okay, it's quality issues. Fine, we'll sign off, but you should have a benchmark. Anyone disagree? No? Okay. So the other thing, some of you are already live. You have a new project with us. Let's say we're configuring stuff, deploying, maybe migrating data over. Extremely important to do a full data backup, right? What do I mean by that? It's not a backup of you just download it into an Excel backup. No, entire org backup, right? And there are paid tools that can do it. As an implementation partner, we have our own internal tools we use to back up your all the objects, every data, metadata, settings, records, attachments. We back up everything into a separate, we have SOC 2 type 2 compliance. So we get your approval, we put it into a separate SQL server, right? It automatically goes into your org, creates all the tables for every object, every field you have. It'll back up everything. Only then we allow our employees to move configuration and data. Unless you sign off and say, you know what, don't back up my data, go ahead and I'm approving. We'll say, okay, you know what, I highly recommend against it. You should have a backup before you do upload new data. But even if you're creating new things, you should back up data, because what happens, you create a new object, new solution, it's links to another solution. And let's say you have an automation on the new solution that goes and messes up the other object. What happens then? Right? That can happen. So back up your data. Extremely important. We talked about UAT. Now, hypercare phase. So one of the factors what I saw companies succeed in other verticals is ongoing managed services. So I'll explain what that is. So like I said, Valerie is an internal admin. She is maintaining the system, but then she runs into an issue, right? Maybe you said on the original scope, you had one approval process, right? And you run into a process like, I need to build a new approval process, or I need to make this enhancement. What happens is every time you have a small development work, maybe Valerie can handle 90%, but those 10%, right? You should have an ongoing admin service, like 5 hours a week, that you can tap into. Valerie can tap into it and get those complicated questions answered, things developed. Because what happens is otherwise you have to go back, create a whole project that will cost you way, way more, right? Most ongoing developer admin service on Specright is way cheaper than if you create a brand new project. So that strategy has worked, like done miracle for many, many companies. So I would recommend that as an ongoing solution, just 5 hours a week, that will make internal admin very successful, because 5 hours from a trained admin, trained developers, it's like 20 hours from an internal admin. So our implementation process, like I said, it's PMP led. We heavily focus on architecture. We heavily focus on making sure it's built ground up. And if a client comes to us in the middle where its org is already developed, you want to build new things, we will do it. But we highly recommend doing an architecture review. So we have a process, automated process, and some manual where we review the entire org. We tell you, okay, this is good, this is bad, you should look at this, etc. So if you are doing a new project, I'd recommend doing a full org architecture review before you build something new. Anything else?
So you said 20 hours of internal admin
Yes.
equal to 5 hours separate?
5 hours of, like managed services, because what we have is, at least on the Micronet side, we provide a blended service. So, if you did an architect, developer, whatever role, it's all included in that. So you get one rate and you just say, hey, I just need this, we'll take care of it. And that's all our resources are doing day in and day out. So for them, they can get things done. It's a screen time, not like you're taking a break, lunch, etc. Right? So that 5 hours of screen time is way, way more powerful. And maybe you're doing 40 hours a week, but that 5 hours will make you look like a super admin.
How do we know how long it's take?
How do you know?
How do we know how long?
Oh, you get estimate as you work with a dedicated line of contact who is, they're assigned to you personally. Say, hey, can you do this? Yes, it will take X hours. And let's say it will take 20 hours. So we allow you to borrow from future weeks. So we try to give people a predicted, sometimes you may need 20 hours 1 week, and next 2 weeks you'll need nothing. So what we do is we allow you to kind of borrow from future hours. So as long as you're a client within a contract year, you can use up your hours earlier. Maybe you won't need any next 2 weeks. So you can bank your hours, at least for Micronetbd managed services. All right, thank you so much.